All right, we are live and welcome again to another episode of the Edlow podcast. And I am here with two scholarly powerhouses when it comes to Mormon studies. So the gates of hell will not prevail against us in this podcast. We will have no no connectivity issues. We resolved all issues of mics and things. But I have Patrick Mason and Matthew Harris here. Hello, Patrick and Matthew. How are you?
Good. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Josh.
So I've had both of you guys on in podcasts, and I can tell you that these podcasts, particularly, especially among the listeners, I have a very diverse group of listeners, but both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and even some who are not, are very interested in your guys' podcasts. For different reasons. The one I had with Patrick really dealt, even though we talked about it in scholarship, we talked about faith crisis and some of the issues facing the church. And then, Matt, we talked with you about the books you've written, particularly about race and the priesthood, and then also about Ezra Taft Benson and the political beliefs that he brought in, and quite a diverse response as well to both all of the podcasts we've done. So I'm really glad that we got you both on here, because I really want to talk with both of you about a few different topics, particularly about what you guys do versus what someone might read and say a Deseret book. But before we go into that, I want to ask you both, you guys have kind of devoted at least a large portion of your lives to the study and this dissemination of information about Mormon history. Why is that, do you think, so important for people to understand and read? Patrick, you can go first.
Okay. Well, for me, I mean, I was bit by the history bug pretty early on in my life as an undergraduate, and I knew I wanted to go on and be a historian, but I did not. I had no plans of studying Mormonism as my main area of focus. If you would have asked me both as an undergraduate or in the early years of graduate school, are you going to spend your life dedicated to studying Mormonism and disseminating information about it? I would have said, what? No. It was a bit of an accident, and I won't tell the whole story, but I do think it's important. I mean, I'm totally dedicated to the study of history because I think it helps us reflect on what it means to be human. There's lots of other ways to do that, and there's lots of other really good and valuable things to do with your life. I wouldn't trust to fly on a plane that's built by historians, but I think history is a great way for us to reflect on just simply this human condition that we share, to have a window onto past lives, to try to understand what happened, and then to reflect on what that means for us in the present. Now, because of a series of sort of unplanned events, I've ended up spending my life, or at least my professional life, focusing on Mormonism. And for me, it's really two things. One, I just find it inherently and endlessly fascinating. I think Mormonism, I always say, and I tell my students, like, Mormonism is just a really fun sandbox to play in. And it allows me to ask and get at lots of big questions that I'm interested in. I mean, I was trained primarily as an American historian, and so that's mostly what I work on. So Mormonism is just a lot of fun. But of course, I'm also, still very much an active member of the church. And so then the history that I do in my day job, then when I come home at night or on Sundays, then it gives me opportunities to reflect on it in a different way, oftentimes theologically. And so then it has a separate set of meanings for me. But mostly, I just think it's really interesting, and I think it is, again, it's useful for us to connect with these past lives.
Yeah, I agree. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what you just said, Patrick. When I was at BYU, I did a bachelor's and a master's there. And I remember when I was a graduate student, a couple of my faculty mentors approached me and they said, "Don't do Mormon history. It's like quicksand. If you get in, you'll never get out." And that was, the funny comment. The other real comment was, "You'll never get a job." And this was in the 1990s, before there was a flowering of Mormon history. There's a lot of academic presses now, as Patrick knows, that publishes Mormon stuff. But back then, there was really just the University of Illinois Press and kind of the University of Utah Press. But now there's several other academic presses publishing on Mormon studies. But anyway, it was probably good advice at the time, and I listened to them very carefully. And I did my training in American history, specializing in early America. And then about, 12 years ago, I guess I discovered the sandbox that Patrick referred to. And I jumped in it, and I thought, this is fun. So, but on a serious note, I grew up with, we've talked about Ezra Taft Benson. He was the prophet when I was growing up. He was the prophet on my mission. And so I often thought about him as I got older, about the things I learned. I remember seeing his quotes on our refrigerator. And anyway, so of course, we're the products of our environment. And so that got me interested in our past, our shared past in Mormon history. And then also, of course, why is Mormon history important? I mean, it helps us to reflect on who we are as people, I think. It's part of our faith tradition. And it also, when we hear things from either leaders or we read things in the news, there's always a context to this, right? And I'm reminded of, I just finished reading Steve Taysom's book on Joseph F. Smith. Patrick, I'm sure you've probably read it by now. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of something in that book that I guess I knew but didn't really quite think a lot about, which was that Joseph Fielding Smith got a lot of his material from his father. The need to systematize the church teachings, the need to get your voice out there, the need to create, doctrinal harmony. I mean, this is most evident in Joseph Fielding Smith, but really it's from his father first and foremost, as Taysom argues, and I think he's right on that. Yeah, so anyway, context is really, really important when we hear things taught. Also, history is about change over time, and I'm not the same person I am now in my early 50s as I was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so I like to see how people change and what leads them to change, hopefully for the better. But I think that's important when we study history, is to see how people change and in the forces that led them to that change.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you guys both said there that I actually really like. One, and this is something that I don't understand. Like, I'm sure you both are, aware that some of the things that you guys have said on this podcast, or any podcast really, probably does draw some criticism from kind of in the box thinkers about the church. And the thing I've never understood about that is exactly what Patrick said, which is we're all human. Right. And it's really, I personally think it's nice to hear the humanity behind these kind of exalted men that we sometimes exalt these men into some like figure, cult of personality figure that like can do no wrong. And it's really helpful for me to see these people. It almost makes me in a weird way feel like I have a chance when these prophets, these people who I believe are prophets, make mistakes or do things that show their humanity. And the other thing that I think is important about what you just said is context is important, because sometimes it informs the reason why things happen the way they did. Like, I have an example of in a few years ago, was dealing with a stake president who gave me some advice. I won't get into the specifics, but gave me some advice, and I was really confused by the advice. And then we became closer and closer. And as we became closer, I learned more about his story because I heard about his background. It made me understand why he was giving the advice that he was. And it made me have a completely different perspective and greater respect for him as both a president as a human being for the advice he gave, right or wrong. Right. It made me understand where it was coming from, and that it really was coming from a place of love and trying to do what's right. And if you don't have that, there's a lot of people out there who, I think that might be part of the reason why sometimes people in church that I've known who've left because of being offended by somebody forget that about a bishop or a stake president. Now that kind of puts me into another spot, which I think is really interesting about the both of you. And that is that you have very much different approaches to how you in my perspective, on how you deal with scholarship and kind of what you teach. Patrick, our podcast was really very much about how to apply this stuff, this scholarly stuff, to faith. And then, like with Matthew, with Matt, it was more of I only want to focus on the scholarship itself. And I wanted to ask you both what you think the utility is of your perspectives and kind of why you approach it that way. So Patrick, let's start with you again.
Okay, well, so it's interesting the way that you frame that, because I think that that what Matt and I do on a day-to-day basis from 9 to 5 is pretty much exactly the same. That so many members of the church know me because of the books I published with Deseret Book, the more devotional books like Planted, where I apply and sort of read some of this history through a theological or devotional or pastoral lens. But I've got a whole bunch of other books that are published by university presses that if people read it, that they say, wait a minute, where did Brother Mason go? In fact, I've had members of my ward sometimes come in and sit on my classes at the university, because they've heard me teach gospel doctrine or something. They say, oh, that'd be great. I'd love to come sit on your class. And I say, oh, sure, fine. And they come and they're like, wait a minute, what happened to my gospel doctrine teacher? Right. And I've got I don't shy away from who I am and my commitments, but I always have students who wonder what my faith commitments are, because in the classroom and as a scholar, I'm doing what I'm trained to do as a historian. I'm not there to advance any particular set of beliefs. And I'm there to have a kind of fidelity to the evidence as we have it, and then to teach my students how to interpret it as historians. Now, certainly, then I do have this other side of me that's been going on for the past decade. Also, not something that I ever anticipated doing, but that I've sort of just been learning on the fly, and so some of the recent books, the books that people read and a lot of members of the church read and know me for. They are more theological reflections on the history, but the history itself, I take a lot of pride in my training as a historian. Now, maybe I've got blind spots. Maybe other people look at my historical stuff and say, no, he's reading that too much through a Mormon lens, and I'm interested in that. And of course, I can't escape who I am. But for me, there's a kind of biculturalism and a bilingualism at play. That in a lot of ways, Mormonism is my native tongue, but I've worked really, really hard and spent a lot of times immersed in the culture and the language of the academy. And I take really seriously my ability to speak that language and operate in that culture.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate that. Matt, how about you?
Well, in the context of podcasts, I always tell people that when I do podcast work, I'm not interested in sort of faith questions, because I really want them to focus on the scholarship. Mm-hmm. And I follow the same sort of guidelines, whether I'm talking to BYU Studies. They did a podcast with me a couple of years back. It's kind of funny. A week later, I'm doing John Dehlin, right? Mormon story.
Yeah. Well, I got to real quick before you go. That's what I appreciate about both of you. And that is that, like, you're not afraid to talk to anybody. And some people, I think, worry about that. And I think that's great. I think it's great that you don't shy away from a John Dehlin or a BYU podcast. And you're the same either way.
Yeah, I always tell the podcasters the same little spiel, which is, let's focus on my scholarship and let's not criticize the brethren or the church on air. And if you do that, then I just don't want to do that. That's just not my role. And as long as you can adhere to those rules, then I'm good with that. And when I did John Dehlin, I guess in 2020, it's been a while, but we did 3 marathon interviews, and he adhered to the rules. He didn't cross any boundaries. And so I really appreciated that. And I thanked him later for that. So anyway, I want them to focus on the scholarship. That's really, really what I want to do. But from I guess a faith perspective, I don't deal with faith things like Patrick has in my work, but I do follow the Richard Bushman line of thinking, which is, and for your listeners who may not know Richard Bushman, he's one of the Mormonism's best historians. He's a retired professor of history at Columbia University and been a faithful Latter-day Saint for a long time. And he wrote, happened to have it on my desk. He wrote one of the seminal books on Joseph Smith. It came
Great
out.
book.
Yeah, it is a good book. Anyway, but he talks about, he said this on more than one occasion, both in podcasts and things he's written, which is that let's not hide anything. Let's get it all out there. And that'll inoculate members, when they come across some difficult or challenging things online. And as long as it's out there and you don't hide from it, then you can learn from it and grow from it. But if you hide from it, people are going to sniff that out and they're going to call you out on that. And what's interesting is that that's the approach he took with Rough Stone Rolling. And he took a lot of heat for that because the church's standard narrative is being challenged in ways that most members are not used to, right? Patrick and I can read that book, and maybe you, Josh, because you're a reader, and you can learn things, or you wouldn't be surprised of things because you've read other things, right? But he's challenging the narrative. You're learning about Father Smith liked alcohol. You're learning about, the Book of Abraham he says it was a revelation, really not a translation. These are all new things for Latter-day Saints. He introduces polyandry for the first time. This book was published in 2005. So the Saints aren't used to these kinds of discussions. And with Bushman being the good historian that he is, he talked to some of the church leaders in Salt Lake before he did it. He got a blessing from all people, Boyd K. Packer. And the reason why I say of all people, with a smile, is because the late Boyd K. Packer did not believe in writing an open and honest history like that. He wanted history to be, more faith promoting. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, Brother Bushman took a lot of heat for that. And I know that because he wrote a book about his book. It's a series of journal entries from Rough Stone Rolling, how the academic community treated the book, how CES people who teach for the church looked at it or received the book, and then just how common members received it. And the answer is it was a mixed bag. He tried to please all kinds of people, but he ended up not pleasing as many as he had hoped.
Yeah. I remember when I first read that book, and I remember the controversy surrounding it. And I just remember thinking, even back then, I was like, this is kind of refreshing. Because at the very beginning, he even explains the issue, right? The issue of there's Mormon apologists, and then there's the Mormon, the people who they're antagonists. And I want to just do something that's just straight down the line. And I had that same reaction as I talked about earlier. And that's what I appreciate about our conversations. What I find so interesting is the reason I agree with you guys and why I love having you on my podcast is because, at least anecdotally, my friends who have left for whatever reason, they're not leaving because they found out that Joseph Smith, translated the Book of Mormon with a stone and a hat for the first time. They're not doing it because of any one specific thing in history. They're doing it because they feel as though they were kind of misled along the way. And so it's kind of that old adage that it's not the deed, it's the cover up that's damaging. And not that it's necessarily a cover up, but what I mean is that I think it's important to have these conversations out there. And so anyhow, that kind of leads me to the next point, which is that you mentioned Boyd K. Packer kind of wanted things to be a little more faith promoting, which is what we see in what you've defined for me as devotional literature, which you'll find in Deseret Book, versus what you guys do in the academic world. And Matt, you brought up beforehand that Patrick has a unique perspective because he's done both, whereas Matt, you focused all on the scholarship. Perhaps you guys can first talk about, I'd like to know, in your view, what that means. If someone doesn't know what that means, what it means, and then why you think each could be important. And so let's start with Patrick with his unique perspective as both. dancing that fine line between heresy and and good practice, you know.
Well, maybe you're the host, but I want to toss it over to Matt to have
Oh,
him define the academic, and then maybe I can add, sort of a little bit more of what I've done on the other side too, if
fair
that's
enough.
all right.
That's good.
Yeah. So I think the academic, I'm going to speak for myself. I wouldn't presume to speak for other academics, but for me, writing about religious history, Mormonism in particular, is that in academic history, it would be, let's see, it's challenging to write with faith commitments in mind. And what I mean by that is I'm going to write a book, but I've got to make my subject look good. Or I'm going to write a book and I want to make my subject look bad because I don't like him. And I think that that's irresponsible on both accounts. I think that you really have to look at the evidence and you have to be balanced. You have to be sensitive, and you can't pull punches, and I'm not here to, pick on Elder Packer, of course, but Elder Packer said something about some things that are true aren't very useful. That is something that an academic historian, those are principles that an academic historian would be difficult to follow, right? Because you can't really cherry pick. And we have sort of our own Hippocratic oath, which is that we see evidence and we have to determine if that evidence is credible. We have to determine if it's worth putting in our book. And I think that we want to see our people in all of their triumphs and in some cases in some of their failures. And I think that's what a good book does. That's why I do like the Stephen Taysom book, because I think he did a pretty good job walking that balance. And Richard Bushman does a pretty good job walking that balance. He's not afraid to criticize Joseph Smith's flaws, but also he's not afraid to praise the prophet either. I think, again, that's what a skilled person does. So the other thing the rule that I follow as I write is that I always ask myself, one, is this a balanced work? Am I trying to be balanced? Am I going overboard to be balanced? Am I being sensitive to sensitive issues? And secondly, am I writing about this Mormon figure differently than I would if it were a Catholic figure, an evangelical figure? And if I answer yes, I'm writing about it differently. I'm treating the Mormon figure with kid gloves. I mean, that's wrong. I don't think that's what I strive to do. I want to treat Mormon leaders like I would if I were writing a book about the Pope, right? Or any other famous leader. So those are the rules that I try to follow. And, sometimes when you write about controversial things, I've written about some controversial things in my career. Patrick knows my stuff pretty well. And Elder Benson is a controversial figure. And, I tried to be balanced. I had to think about it a bit because it wasn't a biography on him. It was a book about his political views and how they influenced the church. But I remember late in the editing process, I came across a letter from the Wisconsin Historical Society, of all places. And it was a journalist who wrote Elder Benson a letter. And this journalist is the one that really tarnished Secretary Benson's image early in the Eisenhower administration. He basically, this journalist, his name was Clark Mullenhoff, he told Secretary Benson, he said, look, you're taking McCarthyism too far. You've just accused somebody of being a communist. You have no evidence for it. And he led this charge to get Benson in trouble with the boss, Eisenhower. Anyway, and I found a letter from 1969, so many years after Benson had left the cabinet. And Benson wrote Mollenhoff just a beautiful letter out of the blue. And he said, I was just thinking about you the day, and I forgive you for anything that you've done or said to me. And I hope that you'll forgive me for anything I've done or said to you. And I thought, man, this is such a generous letter on his part. And so I decided I wanted to put that in my book because it gave you a perspective and a side of Benson that, you didn't see before. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's the long and short of it. I think it's important to not write with faith commitments, either pro or con, and also to treat Mormon leaders like you would other religious leaders. Oh, let me say if I can say one last thing, I'm sorry. One last thing. I don't think, and this is a controversial statement, I'm sure critics would get mad at me for saying this, but I don't think it's my role to judge the validity of somebody's religious experience. I want religious actors to speak for themselves. If they said they had a vision, they had a vision. And the readers can determine themselves if they think it's true or not, right? But I know that Bushman got some flack for not offering naturalistic assumptions of Smith's visions. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, I'm with Bushman. I don't think that that's his role to have to sort of give all of these alternative reasons for the visions. I mean, Bushman just sort of laid it out. He claimed he had these visions, and believe him or not. And that's how I approach religious history. And that's, not everyone does that, but that's really one of the rules I follow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just following up on that, I don't understand what they expect you as a historian to do. So are they saying that, I guess, like you said, I mean, you're just presenting the evidence. You're not saying whether it's valid or not. So they want you to say, well, he said he had a vision, but it could have been this, and this, like kind of speculating on other things that could have happened that might have been more naturalistic. I just don't understand what they're expecting. You're not necessarily a scientist, right? You're you're a historian.
You can offer other critiques for sure. I mean, and they're valid. I'm just giving you my preference, really. Let me give you an example. Bushman, of course, wrote a big book, and there's lots of things to criticize and certainly praise. But I remember reading about polyandry, a very controversial topic, and he introduces it, so he gets it out there in the narrative, which is good. But he doesn't really stop and pause and ask, what does it mean? How does it fit? And he basically just says, we don't know a lot about it. And I remember reading that. I'm thinking, Bushman, it's your job to tell us more about it, or at least to make some reasonable, conjecture about why the prophet did it. And he didn't do that. But anyway, it is a legitimate thing, Josh, for historians to offer plausible reasons why religious leaders do what they do. But when someone claims a revelation or a vision, my own personal style, I don't feel the need to have to critique it. I just let them speak in their own words, and then the readers can make of it what they will.
Have there been books since that book that have gone deeper into the polyandry, or has that kind of been still we don't know much about it?
You want me to take that, or do you want to, Patrick?
Yeah, there's been a lot more scholarship on polygamy over the past 25 years. I mean, that's the thing to appreciate, is actually how quickly this terrain has changed in this century. And so when Richard Bushman published that book in 2005, I mean, that's not even 20 years ago. So in some ways, it's a blink of an eye. But in terms of this field and controversial topics like polyandry, that Bushman, he wasn't the first to ever address it. Most of the things he talked about, almost everything he talked about in there, other people had addressed at some point. He popularized it in a lot of ways because his book had so many more readers, and just because of who he was as a person, as a well-known Latter-day Saint, as Matt mentioned. And so, there's been a lot of scholarship since then, and there will continue to be more. That there are new biographies of Joseph Smith being prepared right now that I know are going to spend a lot more time with polygamy than Richard did. And so this is one of the things about academic history that sometimes people also don't appreciate, is that we don't just lay out the facts. We are making arguments. We make judgments, as Matt said, about which sources to include, which sources are credible, which sources are not. And reasonable people, reasonable historians, good historians can sometimes disagree on those things. We do interpret the history. We're not just antiquarians. We're not just collecting a bunch of stuff and then publishing it. We're making judgments. We're making arguments. We're making interpretations along the way. I think and I would agree 110% with everything that Matt said. I think the one other thing that I would say about the academic study of religious history, and I always tell my students this on day one of our classes, is that using the tools of history, using the disciplinary tools and skills and methods that we've developed over the past 150 years in the professional study of history, I cannot tell you, A, whether there is a God, and then B, what God was doing on a Tuesday afternoon in 1831 or whatever, pick your date, right? And so I can tell you what people thought God was doing, or their encounter with the divine, or how they reported it, but I can't make any kind of objective claims about what divine forces, whether we call it God or Allah or Vishnu, was doing on a particular day in history. So history is agnostic in that sense, and that's one of the reasons why I think some believers get frustrated with academic history because they want us to not be agnostic. But given the skills and methods and discipline that we have as historians, we have to be agnostic, not about whether or not people experience the divine. We can document that really fully, but what exactly those divine forces are, whether they're real, quote unquote, and so forth. Those are things that now it's true. I think sometimes scholars move from agnostic to atheist on these things. So I think this is where Matt's comment is also really helpful. I think there can be a kind of debunking mode and a purely materialist mode that no, obviously there's only material forces in this universe, and so we have to come up with a psychological explanation for all these things or some other kind of material explanation. I'm much more in line with Matt on this. That I think, again, just from our disciplinary commitments, I think we're more honest, we're more agnostic rather than atheistic.
Yeah. Real quick, before we go into the devotional literature part, I wanted to ask, you mentioned, Matt, I don't, I have to check myself to make sure, am I, treating him with kid gloves, but do you also often feel as though the opposite is true? Like you sit there and you go, okay, so like, am I trying so hard to not treat them with kid gloves that I'm going a little harsh? I mean, do you feel like that kind of pendulum swinging at times? And where do you strike that balance?
That's a good question. So certainly that's what writing is a lengthy draft process, right? You get your ideas out and obviously you cut and refine, but one of the things that you do in the editing stage is you want to look at tone, right?
Mhm.
And for me, when I think I've struck a decent tone, I mean, what do I know, right? It's my work. It sounds fine, but yeah, that's why you have other people read your work, people whose opinions you trust. Patrick knows this, right? There are people who give you good critiques, right? And you keep going back to them because they give you good critiques. And there are some people you probably wouldn't give your work to again because they don't really give good critiques. And either they're yeah. So, but that's what peer review is. You have friends that review your work, and they can tell you. I have friends that I want to review my work because I know that they're going to give me different things, right? If I give Patrick my book, I know I'm going to get Patrick's critiqued a couple of 3 or 4 things of mine now, and I know that I'm going to get a critique from him that it's valuable. And I know that if I give my work to someone like, say, Matt Bowman, I'm going to get a different critique from Patrick's, but equally valuable, right? And that's really, really helpful. So these are folks who are sort of, helping you to produce the best scholarship you can produce, whether it's tone or content or whatever. And so that's how I sort of iron those things out, is that I have people whose opinions I trust read my work.
Yeah. Patrick, you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is the virtue and the value of the peer review system. It's not perfect, and also that scholars, even though much of what we do is actually quite lonely and solitary, most of our work in the archive is solitary. Most, writing is a very solitary thing. But it's at that point of we all, any scholar worth their weight in salt, will share their work with others, both through the formal peer review process and informally. A lot of people are part of writing groups or just have friends whose opinions they seek out. And so that's where the community is really important. Is it perfect? No, because those other people are human too, right? They all have their interests and so forth. But I actually do think when it's working well, and most of the time it does, the peer review process is I mean, it's a well vetted system for the production and for the production of knowledge.
Interesting. Now let's talk about devotional literature and its place in this, in all of this. Patrick, you've been there, so maybe you lead that discussion. I'd also like to hear what the experience is like writing for a Deseret book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So again, when I started to make this shift, it really was about a decade ago. And I've always maintained, I mean, I'm still publishing, all my academic books, but so this has always been kind of a side hobby, a side project. Um, and it just came out of my own personal, I started being asked to do a bunch of firesides around 2012, 2013 around church history issues. this is the other thing to keep in mind, that when I started doing that in 2012, there wasn't yet such a thing as a gospel topics essay. And so the resources that the institutional church was providing to people were, shall we say, limited. And as I was going out and doing these firesides, people, it was clear they were just starving for more. They just wanted more. And they would always ask me, like, where can I learn more? What can I, where can I get, frameworks like this, like the kinds of things that I was talking about? And I didn't have much to point them to other than the scholarship itself. Go read Dialogue, go read the Journal of Mormon History. I can give you a bunch of big, long, boring books that you can read. But it was clear that people wanted more than just the facts. They wanted frameworks. And so that's when I finally, it was actually in a fireside and a kind of Q&A afterwards, and I could just see like the pain and the yearning in this one woman's eyes. I'll never forget it, where she said, like, where can I read more about this? Like, what book can I pick up? And I said, there is no book at this point, like even the Terrell and Fiona Gibbons book, The Crucible of Doubt, was really the first book to address head on kind of faith crisis issues within Mormonism. And it wasn't out yet. And I said that there's nothing other than the scholarship. And I could just see this pain in her eye. And like, it was this moment, I'm like, okay, I guess I'm writing that book, right? I had no intention to do it. For me, I felt like it was a kind of calling or vocation. So I did it, woke up early in the mornings and churned it out. And I didn't know. So you asked, how do you write for Deseret Book? I didn't know how to, because I'd never done it before. Nobody ever trained me to do that. That's not what I was trained to do at Notre Dame. I was just trained to be a historian. So I was literally making it up as I went along. I wrote the entire book in trying to do the best I could, essentially responding to the people whose questions I was getting in firesides. And it really was about, okay, let's take the facts as a given. Let's not argue with the facts. Here are the facts as we know them, based on the scholarship that lots of good scholars have done over the past several decades. And so here are the facts. Now, what do we do with them? That's what I was trying to do in Planted. And that's now a move beyond what I do in my day job. That's a move beyond my role as a historian. And so now I'm working more in a pastoral mode. Now I'm working more in a theological mode. So now I am bringing God into history. Now I'm entering a different, or I'm accepting a different set of evidences, a different set of assumptions. And theology always operates within the context of a community of faith. So I was talking now as a Latter-day Saint to other Latter-day Saints and trying to make sense of these kinds of things. And so then, so that's what I tried to do. Now, there's lots of different forms of devotional writing. Not everybody was happy with what I did on Planted. They thought I still, gave too much away, and it was too critical in some places. And then I've written a couple other things since then. Partly, one of the things I've learned is I've just got to write shorter, and I've got to write. I can't use jargon. I don't. All the conventions that I do as an academic historian, with every piece of evidence that I can find relevant, lots and lots of footnotes, all those kinds of things. I've learned to pare that back in my devotional writing. It's just an audience issue, and so yeah, it's for me. It's just asking a different set of questions. It's asking and admitting a few other kinds of evidences. I don't think in my devotional writing I've sacrificed my commitment to historical truth, but now I'm just asking, what are the theological ramifications of that historical truth?
Yeah.
What was if you don't mind me asking, what was the process, Patrick, that you went through? Was it just an in-house? They just have in-house editors that vet the manuscript. What was that process like?
Yeah, with Planted, it was really interesting because, again, Deseret Book didn't ask me to write that book. I just wrote it entirely on my own. They didn't know who I was. I approached Maxwell Institute. And so the Maxwell Institute had an in-house editor, Blair Hodges, who's fantastic. He was working there at the time. So he and I worked on the whole manuscript together. And we decided we're going to finish the book and then pitch it to Deseret Book. We're not pitching the idea to them. We're pitching the finished book to them. And we did. And Deseret Book, again, they had no idea who I was. I was just some obscure historian. And so they were, I think it was mostly because of their relationship with the Maxwell Institute. They said, all right, well, okay, like send us the manuscript. I mean, like, no promises. Our publication schedule is really full. I mean, they were polite, but hedging. So we sent them the manuscript, and literally it was like 3 or 4 days later. It was like lightning fast. The editor called me back. She's great. She just retired. And she's like, this is it. This is exactly what we want. We've been waiting for somebody to do a book like this, right? We just didn't know that you were the one who was going to do it. And then at that point, I have to say, and I had some of my biases and preconceptions about the kinds of books that Deseret Book was publishing and putting on its shelves. I have to say they were phenomenal to work with. 100% supportive. They got what I was trying to do. They wanted me to do it in my own voice, from my own perspective. It went through their internal review process. They have a very rigorous internal review process that is checking. It's different than the peer review process that historians go through. It's kind of an orthodoxy peer review process. And I was shocked at how little they asked me to change. There was really, there was only one thing that one significant kind of substantial part that they came back with questions on. And so we just entered into a conversation. I said, here's how I'm seeing it. Here's why I'm making the case that I am. Here's why I'm arguing for what I'm arguing for. And we came to a place where we both felt good about it. So I have to, and that was my experience with them, with Proclaim Peace, another book I've done with them as well. And so I have to say the process was much better than I had anticipated. And I think that sometimes people would guess that it's like.
Interesting. So real quick, I wanted to ask you, Patrick, because that leads me to something, and I know you got a heart out in a few minutes, and then Matthew and I can continue on this conversation. But, so that puts you in kind of a precarious position, I think, a little bit, in that now you've written for Deseret Book. Now you're also an academic. So your academic audience wants one thing, your theological audience wants something different. And then, you're a mixture of the two. You probably rub a lot of people the wrong way, and at times, which I appreciate. I like that. I do that too. And the thing is that you recently started, first of all, your podcast with John DeLynn, where you went on Mormon stories. I would say I listened to all 8 hours of it, and
I'm sorry.
No, it was absolutely refreshing and fantastic because, one, you didn't shy away from anything he asked. And I don't think I'd ever seen John DeLynn that subdued in a podcast either, because you really caught him in some things that made him think. But after that, you actually started a podcast with John DeLynn together, and you got a little bit of heat from that. And perhaps maybe you can explain what happened and just how that kind of what that made you feel like.
Yeah. So actually, the way you described it at the very beginning is exactly the way I feel. For me, all of this is just integrated in here, right? It's just who I am. Like, I've worked through this stuff. I have a theological framework that makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to anybody else, but I don't really care because it's mine, right? It's me. And then, anything I say and share, if it's helpful to people, fantastic. But I also recognize everybody has their own journey. But I, earlier I mentioned, a sense of biculturalism and bilingualism, and that's really the way I feel. I feel 100% at home when I go to church. I feel 100% at home when I go in the secular academy, because I actually think that I find a lot of truth and meaning and purpose in both places. And then again, I do a lot of that integrative work inside my own head. But in terms of when I went on Mormon Stories, I think neither John nor I knew exactly what to expect. We had not planned the questions in advance. And so that really was a kind of free-flowing conversation. And the thing that we were both blown away with, it was actually quite moving, was the response of listeners to that conversation. Both of us just got, both in terms of quantity and quality of response. I mean, people were so moved by what we did there. And it's so interesting that the feedback that we each got separately was almost the exact same. People rarely talked about the substance of what we talked about. And what moved them so much was simply the fact that we sat down and talked. We talked generously, which we talked with one another honestly, with a lot of vulnerability, and with a lot of respect and for one another, without personal attacks or anything. Just the kind of conversation we had, and I think it just shows that people are starving for that kind of thing, right?
Well,
Starving.
and also real quick, just imagine if every sibling who had a sibling that left the church could have a conversation like
Yeah,
that. How
exactly.
different everything would be. Yeah.
And that's what we heard. I mean, I literally have emails in my inbox that where the subject line is "You saved my marriage," and it's because of that. Again, it's not because of I gave some data point, right?
Right.
We simply modeled a way to talk to one another, and I don't think we did anything revolutionary, but maybe in the world we live in today, maybe decency and generosity are revolutionary. And so after we did that, and based on the response that we got, I mean, John and I stayed in touch, and we said, well, what would it look like to maybe continue to model something like that? So we came up with this idea of doing a regular podcast where and what we decided is we don't want to get on and just like debate all the truth claims. In some ways that's been done. We kind of know what those sides sound like. So that was less interesting to us than just like modeling this kind of civil discourse. So we said, well, let's just talk about whatever happened in the news that week around Mormonism, and then we'll just talk about it from our different perspectives. And we brought in Jana Reese, who we both respect. I mean, just one of the best journalists and columnists, working on these kinds of issues, also with a Ph.D. in American religion. And so the three of us started this, and we long story short, we did 2 episodes, and we knew they weren't good enough. We knew they weren't tight enough. But we put them out there kind of with the idea of like getting peer review, like getting feedback and hey, what do y'all think about this? How can we make it better? And so forth. And I have to say, I think we made a couple of tactical errors in the way that we went about it. There were some framings that we didn't do sufficiently. It was never imagined as a Mormon Stories product. Actually, it was always, we were pretty committed to the idea it was going to be very separate from Mormon Stories, but we hadn't fully built out all of our own platforms. So we released the first 2 episodes on Mormon Stories, and I think that confused a lot of people. So again, I think we made a couple of tactical mistakes. And again, lots of generous response, lots of people appreciating and seeing what we were trying to do. Really, I'm very committed to peace building, and that's what I thought about this in terms of this podcast. Not everybody saw it that way. John, especially, Jana to some degree, more than I have appreciated, but especially John is just in a lot of people's crosshairs, whether you want to say rightly or wrongly. And it became, it just got to, and I won't share everything, and I won't share all the private conversations that we had among the 3 of us, but it became kind of untenable, especially for me. And it wasn't doing, and I didn't see a way forward for it to do what I'd anticipated it doing. And so I pulled out, and I tweeted about it, and then got a lot of heat about that and so forth. And so, long story short, I 100% believe, feel at peace with what we were trying to accomplish in that podcast, in terms of just having a conversation, right, and not being afraid, and just being able to talk about it from lots of different perspectives, right, and it's okay to disagree, and I also feel very much at peace. I feel 100% at peace for the reasons I pulled out. And John and Jana and I had some great conversations about that. And we all, I think we all shared a common regret that the project wasn't going to move forward. And I do share that. But we all, we're all on great terms, and so it just didn't work out. But so I believe in the project. This particular thing didn't work out. But overall, this sense of like, hey, we can talk to each other across these lines, and we can learn from one another. I 100% believe in that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you brought that. Like I said, I know you have a heart out, and you're a few minutes
Yeah.
over that, but I can tell you personally that I appreciate your approach. I really do. And like I said, I mean, I was amazed at how I was one of those people who was just shocked about how well those podcasts went. And even with you, Matthew, you had podcast with John too, and they both, I just was it was impressive to me. I wish more people understood the respect that he did have for both of you for coming
Yeah.
on and being willing to do that. And sure, he's got some opinions, and he's salty. You know what I mean? He's definitely salty about what happened to him, and but it is what it is. And so,
Yeah,
well,
maybe
Pat,
the last thing I'll say, and I do have to run, and I apologize. And so you guys can talk about me when I'm gone.
yeah,
But
we will. Don't worry, we will.
yeah,
We
yeah,
will a
yeah.
lot.
Maybe two things on John. I mean, look, we're all just complicated individuals, and we all have our histories. And John has obviously walked a difficult road, and he's borne the pain of lots and lots of other people's stories. And and I've come to in our interactions, both the people have seen on screen and privately, I've come to really respect and honor some of the challenges and difficulties he's been through in trying to be in a place of truth telling. Now, he and I ultimately land differently on some of the faith questions, but I really honor the humanity that he tries to bring to that and to lift up people's stories. I really do. So I'm happy to count John as a friend. And then the last thing that I'll say, just in terms of the overall theme here, in Leonard Arrington's papers, and I can't remember, this shows up in print. I can't remember if it's in Greg Prince's book or if it's in Arrington's, just his published diaries. But he has some correspondence. Somebody's writing, actually a mission president is writing Leonard Arrington a letter. It's when Arrington is church historian, and this mission president is saying, like, are you really sure we want to tell like the whole truth? Like really? Like, are you really committed to this? And Arrington, I wish I would have been prepared, and so I could have read you the quote, but just to paraphrase, Arrington said, he said, of course, I'm committed to tell the truth. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's the 13th article of faith. We believe in being honest, right? But he said, I've, my colleagues and I have spent years going through the church archives, and I can say that there's nothing in there that has dissuaded us from our faith. And then he says, for me, the kind of takeaway is, or the most important insight is, he says, if this is really true, if the church is even an approximation of what we claim it to be, and if we're committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, we shouldn't be afraid of any truth. We shouldn't be afraid of any fact. That we should look at it with courage, with openness, and then do the work of trying to decide what it all means in terms of God's redeeming of his history, of his people. And that's very much the way I feel. So I'm not afraid of any fact. I'm not afraid of any conversation, not afraid of any truth, because ultimately I believe that God can redeem all things, including a very human history that I contribute to.
Yeah, we all do. So, well, Patrick, I know you got to go. So appreciate you taking the time. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Patrick.
You bet. See ya.
All right. So now, Matt, now, you heard a lot about what he said, and, your view as someone who's outside, hearing what he had to say about the process of Deseret Book, what is your takeaway about devotional literature?
It has its place. I think that as long as it's couched as devotional literature, and what I mean by that is devotional literature has faith commitments in mind, right? There are certain boundaries that somebody writing for Deseret Book cannot, encroach upon. And that is, they can't critique the church, they can't critique a doctrine, they can't critique a leader. Those are the boundaries that Deseret Book has set, and that's fine. It's devotional literature. I think the problem with Deseret Book is that when they produce things, this is again my opinion, but when they produce things that they call scholarship, and I think that's where you sort of blur those lines. Because I'm thinking of a book in particular on Nauvoo they did years ago, and it was written by a legitimate historian, but it was published by Desert Book. And knowing what I know about some of the source material, I mean, the writer pulled a lot of punches. And if that were an academic press, that's just something that you're not at liberty to do, or you shouldn't do. So
Wait, at least can I stop you right there? So if you wrote a book like that in an academic press, would it even get published based on the peer review?
well, that's interesting. Of course, it depends on the peer reviewers, right? Maybe we should talk about peer review, how it works first.
Sure.
Yeah, and then come back to that question.
Yeah.
So when you produce a manuscript for an academic press, it's you can get an advance contract. That is, you turn in a prospectus first about what the book's about. You might even do a sample chapter or two. Then you get an advance contract, and then you write the book. Or you can finish the book and then pitch it as a finished product and see if they want to publish it. So what happens is the editor looks at the manuscript or the proposal, and they say, oh, yeah, this is something that's in our catalog. We do publish Mormon history. This is something that we would consider doing. This looks interesting. Or this doesn't look interesting. I'm not even going to send it out for peer review. But what you do as a scholar is you'll give the editor maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 names about people in the field who can do a really good critique of your work. And they take that list of 8 to 10 scholars and they send it out to two of those people. You don't know who they are. And so, or they don't have to follow your list at all. Let's be clear. That's their prerogative. But anyway, they send it out to 2 of your readers, and then it's quite simple. If the 2 readers come in like this, that means they like the manuscript and they recommend publication. Or it could be like that. One says, yes, it's great. The other one says no. Or it could be like this. Well, we need to see. It's not quite ready for publication yet, but if the author does this, this, and this, then maybe we'll give it a yes. So if you get one like that and one like that, that means they can either send it out for a third reviewer to override the negative review, or they can just look at this negative review and say, that negative review is so devastating, we're not going to waste our resources by sending it out to a third person. So it's an anonymous process. And the way that I do it is that when I've published several books with university presses, and I always try to do a balance of Mormon and non-Mormon scholars. And the non-Mormon, of course, would be people who have an interest in Mormon history, right? There are lots of scholars, and Patrick and I know them. I mean, we go to conferences with them. We're on panels with them. And they're not Latter-day Saints, but they make Mormonism part of their professional study. So they write books and articles on Mormonism, just like Patrick and I do. And so I always try to get an outside perspective from one of those folks. And then, I want to get, a perspective from Mormon scholars. So that's my approach. And I always feel like I get the best of both when I do that, because sometimes you can kind of discern the critique, oh, this critique, that looks like it's from the person who's not of the faith, right? Just the way they express themselves, the way they, maybe interpret the material. So that's what I do. Desert Book doesn't do that, obviously. They're devotional. They don't do peer review. It's called blind peer review. So the presses will send it out. You don't know who they are. And the scholars can review themselves or identify themselves if they want to. That's their prerogative. And some scholars will, Patrick, for example, reviewed a book of mine, and this book that's going to be out on the race and priesthood ban here next year. Patrick was one of the reviewers, and I, of course, put him on the list because he's critiqued my work before. And as I said a minute ago, I value his voice. His critique is very helpful. And Patrick agreed to identify himself as one of the university press reviewers, which was great, because that meant if I had additional questions from his critique, I know who to talk to. And that's the whole purpose of it, is in the spirit of being helpful, So it doesn't mean I have to follow anybody's critiques, right? That's part of the thing of an author, is you have to figure out which critique you want to accept or which one you want to reject. But even the ones you reject, it really forces you to think about how people read your work, whether it's tone or content or whatever. And so Patrick and others, have done great critiques, and that's why people like him are, valuable. And I'd like to think that when I critique other people's works, and I do often, both for journals and presses, that I'm giving constructive, helpful critique or feedback to make the finished product the best that it can be. So Desert Book doesn't do that. Theirs is in-house, and that's okay. Again, it's devotional. They have an internal committee, as Patrick said, about they're looking for orthodoxy. They don't want to look for anything that might challenge a testimony or denigrate a leader or something along those lines. Whereas in the university press community, they don't care about faith commitments like that. They just don't care. They want responsible scholarship. And whether it makes the subject that you're writing about look good or bad or indifferent, they don't care. That's just not what they're after. So anyway, that's how I do it, is I try to get a sort of a broad sampling of people who reviewed my work. And I should tell you too that when I send my work in, and I know others would do the same, is that we already have 5 or 6 of our friends critiquing our manuscript before it gets sent to the press.
Right.
So,
and you're just doing that on your own so that you know what it sounds like?
Yeah, because you want to get feedback long before you submit it to the press. You want it to be the best. I mean, you're trying to get it published, right? So you want it to be the best product it can be before it goes out to a blind peer reviewer or blind peer review. So in my case, this new book coming out next year on the priesthood ban, I probably had 6 or 7 or 8 of my friends read it beforehand, and I had friends read certain chapters that I thought they could really help me with.
Interesting.
And then Patrick, of course, read it for the press. And
so when you do that, do you sometimes change what you're doing? Like, do they say, hey, Mike, your tone here, you need to change that up a little bit, and then you make changes, or not? How does that usually work for you?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, usually I've written lots of Mormon books now, so tone is not really an issue for me. I guess the readers will judge that, but usually for me, like, let me give you an example. So I'm writing a book about the priesthood ban, and of course, it's important to have Black Latter-day Saint voices in there, right? And imagine writing a book about the priesthood ban and not getting the voice or perspective of Black Latter-day Saints. I mean, that'd be crazy.
Right.
Nuts. Well, what happens when you don't have a strong record early on of Black Latter-day Saint voices? You've got Elijah Abel, who's a very famous Black priesthood holder in the 19th century. You've got a woman named Jane Manning James. Those are the 2 sort of iconic figures that people write about. And one of my critiquers, one of my friends who reviewed it before it went to the press, he made a great critique. He said, look, it'd be great if, this is the chapter that dealt with the early 20th century, it'd be great if you had a voice from a woman, particularly a Black Latter-day Saint. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's a great suggestion, but they just don't exist. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the source material isn't there. So I wrote back. I suspect that this scholar knew that. And I wrote back and I said, I can't think of anything. I've been in the archives. I just can't think of anything. And he said, well, okay, maybe you can't find a Black Latter-day Saint woman, but what about, is there somebody from the Relief Society? Get their perspective on the ban. And I thought, that's a great suggestion. And so that one critique from a trusted scholar, Matt Bowman's his name. And so that's what Matt said. And so I found Susie Young Gates, Brigham Young's daughter, wrote a book or published a book that it's a racial history of sort of the world. It wasn't an original piece. It was just sort of, she was taken from genealogies from the 19th century and from anthropology textbooks. It was just kind of a cut and splice, if you will. And she didn't claim that it was original. But anyway, it was sort of like a racial history of the world and how people moved and migrated and so forth. And they studied this in Relief Society. 3 of the apostles read the book before they made it an official manual for the Relief Society. So I thought, wow, this isn't just some obscure book. This is something that they read in Relief Society. So I didn't have that in an early draft. And so Matt convinced me that, I don't think he mentioned her name, but he just said, you need a woman's perspective on the band. And so I found Susie Young Gates. I found this book, and I added it, a little chunk in my book. So that's what you do. You're aware of certain things. And when you get those kinds of critiques, it makes the scholarship stronger than it might otherwise be.
It's interesting. I wanted to ask you this because I know, like, for example, if you wanted to learn about the law, I would not recommend that you buy a book that we're reading in law school, right? I mean, just because for just the standard reader, they're just not going to be able to follow it. So now I enjoy reading your books, which are scholarly in nature. Do you think that the kind of rank and file Latter-day Saint, that academic literature on Mormon history is useful?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I wouldn't write if I didn't think it was useful. I think maybe another way to look at your question is, how do we get rank and file members to read scholarship? Because in my experience, very few Latter-day Saints read scholarship. I mean, just I remember on my mission, I took a liking to books early on in my life. I guess my mission would be the first time I was aware of what LDS writers were doing. I fell in love with Hugh Nibley on my mission, for example, and I read other people. Mm-hmm. And I remember, so I grew up in Maine and served a mission in Idaho. So obviously a predominantly LDS population. So I was in a lot of LDS homes, and I remember looking at their libraries, and I was just shocked that very few of them had anything other than from Desert Book, right? Or Seagull or Eborn, or just some LDS presses. So, and I remember my dad growing up, there was a bishop in our ward he was a college professor, actually, and he was a great scholar, a great gospel scholar. That's all I heard. I think my dad conflated Ph.D. with scholar, right? And
right.
And and he was a scholar in his field, a scholar of botany, but my father, he's a scholar of the gospel and all this stuff. Well, I remember going into his house after my mission, and I was just flummoxed that there was nothing of scholarly value in his library. And here's an academic that I would presume, would read things. But anyway, the question is, how do we get people to read this and our scholarship, and why should they spend time reading our scholarship? And for me, my litmus test is always my mother, who is, she's an educated reader, but she's not reading scholarship. And so to my current book that will be coming out, I had her read a chapter, I had her read the introduction, and I want her feedback, from just a sort of a lay person in the pews. How does this look to you? And now scholarship this is new stuff, right? I'm advancing new stuff, new claims. And as I point out in the introduction, that the church has not done a very good job telling the story of the priesthood band. The manuals, you sort of read the manuals. Oh, it just happened. President Kimball had a revelation on June 1st. Well, that's not really what happened. It was a long and lengthy process, as we talked about in a previous podcast. And so this is going to challenge people's narrative, not in a bad way, but it's going to be, in a new way, that there's a lot more to the story than they get from the church manual and the Doctrine and Covenants, when it just says, official declaration 2. And so I use my mother as a litmus test to get her feedback.
Yeah, well, and I agree with what you're saying, because, again, as I said earlier in the podcast, anecdotally, the friends that I have, they aren't necessarily rocked or have any sort of faith struggle with the concept of, in the early 1800s and 1900s, like, white men were racist. That's not something that they struggle with necessarily. What they struggle with is, why am I just now hearing about this? My vision has been that all of a sudden one day Spencer W. Kimball had a revelation and everybody agreed, and then next thing you know, the big day has come, right? And so that's where I think that the struggle is kind of this push-pull between wanting to be faith promoting, but wanting to be honest and truthful about the things that happened and the kind of push-pull between that. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that there is utility in reading these books. I've learned a ton, and it doesn't for me, so when you do these things though, you don't do them with faith in mind at all. But how is as somebody who's reading, would you recommend they read like how would they read this in conjunction with the stuff they're reading in church?
Well, I mean, let's, for example, if you're giving a church lesson on the priesthood ban, I can imagine that my book, or at least the chapter that deals with the revelation, I go into great detail about this process and how it
Yeah, you
weighs
do.
on President Kimball's mind and how he has to work with the 12 who don't want to lift the ban. At least some of them don't, right? And
Yeah.
he wants to sort of work with them to, hey, look, this is God's will. We need to do this for the betterment of the church. So if you read that chapter, this is chapter 7 of my next book. If you read that chapter and you're about ready to go teach a lesson on official declaration number 2, I mean, it is going to give you so much context and background. And I dare say respect and appreciation for President Kimball, because it was no small thing what he had to do. Some of the brethren in the 12 had some very strong views about the ban and African Americans, and they just, Elder McConkie is one of them. And he said something interesting that I think Latter-day Saints totally misconstrued today. He gave this talk in August of 1978 after the ban was lifted. And it was a talk to CES people who work, teachers who work in the church, seminary institute. And he said, forget everything I said. We have a new, I'm paraphrasing, but a new light, a new dawn. And a lot of people took that to mean that forget everything I said about, African Americans in the past and what I said about race and the curse of Cain and all that stuff. That's not what he said. That's not what he meant. What he meant was, I said that the priesthood ban would never be lifted in my lifetime. And clearly I'm wrong, because here we are. Right. So anyway, so Elder McConkie had some very strong views about race. And oddly enough, though, he was one of the first of the apostles to come around to support President Kimball, recognizing that the ban needed to be lifted in order to proselytize the world. So I think it's, I'm not, like Patrick, I'm not afraid of the truth. I think that you have to be honest, right? You can't cherry pick, you can't sweep things under the rug. I don't write, as I said, with faith commitments in mind, but having read enough literature, and I've written a lot about the gospel topics essays, how they came about. So I know a lot about these kinds of issues, that in my experience writing about this, that it never serves the church well to hide something or to sweep it under the rug, particularly when somebody, a Latter-day Saint person, finds out about it. And then all of a sudden the cover-up's always worse than the crime.
Right.
And I think in my experience, the church is, and maybe we should get in the weeds just a minute here, that over the years, at least in the last 50, 60 years, there have been some intense differences among the church leaders about how to tell our story, Mormon history. So let's talk detail for a moment. So Elder Packer, Elder Benson, and Elder Peterson, Marky Peterson, those three had very strong views that if it's not faith promoting, it shouldn't be written or told. And then strangely enough, President Kimball and Elder McConkie, they argued that if Latter-day Saint historians don't tell or write an honest history, then it'll be left to other people to write that history. And so McConkie and Spencer Kimball wanted Latter-day Saints to write histories that would sometimes capture the flaws of leaders. And I can't think of a better example than President Kimball's own son. And his son has written 2 biographies of his father's presidency. One was published in 1977. You can see why that would be a problem, right? Because it happened before the revelation, which is the biggest thing in his ministry, right?
Right.
And then just after the priesthood revelation, he wrote a second book because of what had happened. And I should also say that I think Ed Kimball thought his father was going to pass early. He had health problems. And so he thought, I'll just write this book while he's still alive. Anyway, turns out his father didn't pass away until 1985. But so he wrote a second book. The manuscript was finished in the early 80s, but it wasn't published until the 21st century. And but Ed Kimball told me an interesting story when I met with him years ago. He's now passed. But when I met with him, he said, Matt, I finished the biography on my father, and I let him read it. And there was a part of it he didn't like. He said, you need to make me a little bit more human. I've got flaws. You know what my flaws are. He's talking to his son. I want to see some of those flaws in this book because I want people to recognize me as a human being. And I thought to myself, wow, that's really, really interesting. And of course, the historian in me, what flaws are you talking about, Ed?
Right.
Give me something.
Yeah.
And he gave me one. He said that I wrote a sentence in there that some people didn't like, including Deseret Book. They didn't like this sentence because that's who he ultimately published it with. But I felt that it needed to be in there. And he said that my father had racial prejudices common to people in his generation. I mean, imagine that. A guy that was born in the late 19th century has some racial prejudice.
Right.
And there are people who work for the church who don't want that in the book. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, please. There's a way to tell this story, too, because here's a guy that grew up in Arizona, a small little town in Arizona, who had some racial prejudices. And he becomes the church president who does the most magnificent thing in the history of the church when it comes to race, right? Allows them full inclusivity in the church's rituals. If that's not a great story of evolution, I don't know what is.
Sure.
And so, obviously, I'm not a fan of Elder Packer, Elder Peterson, Elder Benson, and they would have been of the ilk to. They didn't tell Ed Kimball to take that out, but they're of that ilk. If they read the manuscript, they probably would have said, "Don't put that in there." And whereas President Kimball wanted it in there, and so I think it's really, really important for people to see their leaders as humans, not as sort of cardboard cutouts that they can't relate to.
Well, and I think that the at least as a member, I think the utility of that is when something happens that is a mistake, you're a little more empathetic and it doesn't shock you as much. Because like I can tell just based on the conversations I've had with my friends who grew up in the 90s in seminary generation, that's been the struggle, right? Everything the prophet says from the pulpit is doctrine. And then now it's like, well, not everything he says. I mean, it's got to be, if he says it more than once and then everybody else says it's good too, and you hear it's in a manuscript somewhere, then, maybe it's doctrine, it's just, and so it becomes like it becomes hard, that kind of thinking shifting is hard. Whereas if you just understand they're imperfect. I mean, I had an offline conversation with a good friend of mine on this very issue. Actually, it came out due to your podcast on Blacks of the Priesthood, and I shared with him. I go, that it's if you don't have the ability, if the canon is truly open and revelation is moving, then it means that anything can change, and you have to be willing to look at that. You have to be willing to accept that people are human and mistakes are made, and the atonement applies to the church as well, and revelation can happen. So, I thought as you were talking, I thought about a question, and let me give you a little bit of context for this. I went one time I was an Elders Quorum president, and I went to a conference that was specific for bishops and Elders Quorum presidents with Elder Bednar, and there was a Q&A. And they asked him, as a member of the Quorum of the 12, what keeps him up at night. And I was very surprised by his answer, because his answer was very interesting. He said, I am concerned that the growth of the church in Africa is going to be choked out by the traditions of the Western church. And he said if there was anything that was going to destroy the church, it was the traditions of the church that were going to destroy it. And I found that to be very interesting. It wasn't anything about I'm concerned about, at the time President Monson was the president, and I'm concerned that his health is, or anything like that. It was something like that. And so I wanted to ask you, as an academic scholar who studies Mormon studies, what keeps you up at night?
As a scholar, in terms of how people review my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, like, what is it that I mean? Well, let me just provide a little bit more. I gotta think that if you go into your work, there is a portion of you that thinks that what you are doing is very important, right? And I'm sure you don't do it for the money or the accolades, right? So if that's the case, I got to think that this is important to you, which means that there are things about it that concern you. And I'm just curious, like, as you think about this, as you're writing specifically on Mormon studies and these controversial issues, is there anything that worries you about it? There are things that you're concerned about, things that make you sad about it or happy about it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So maybe two things. One would be, of course, you always want people to receive your work in the spirit in which it's given, right? You're trying to be helpful. You're writing the truth as you understand it based on how you interpret sources. And, you want people to be enriched by your work. I mean, there's a reason why we're doing this. You want to learn from it. And so when I speak to Latter-day Saints and various audiences, it's, there's always people, when they're hearing a new narrative, they're like, oh, right. And even talking about Elder Benson, he's a controversial figure,
Yeah, right.
I mean, I can't help that when they feel that way, but I wish they wouldn't, but I always try to be sensitive, but it's true. He's a controversial figure. And I'd be lying if I told you that he wasn't, right? The other thing that worries me or concerns me is that there are some folks who work in the church. They're good people, and they have people above them. The church is always hierarchical, right? And I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is, I think the church has a problem with correlation, right? They always want to produce something faith promoting at the expense of something that ultimately might be harmful in the long run. And for example, I'm thinking about correlation. They review things that the church publishes from the history department. And I don't like, sometimes they redact things that shouldn't be redacted, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, it's one thing to redact sensitive things dealing with the temple. I think most people, I shouldn't speak for scholars, but a fair number of scholars in my world would say that's just fine. It's a sensitive and sacred thing. It should be redacted. That's all good. Maybe redact things that other sensitive things, could be church finances, could be, things along those lines. But what happens is, in my sad experience, we've seen redactions where sometimes we learn that, such and such general authority had a temper, right? We got to redact that. Or
why? Why?
I know. It's frustrating because, well, we'll come back to why it's frustrating. Another one would be, general authority X, cussed once in a while when, something fell on his foot. We gotta get rid of that. And there are some other things too. I'm being a little flippant here, but you get the picture. And as a historian, that's who these people are, right? That's that humanness that we can all relate to. When we have something dropped on our foot, we might say something that we might regret, or we wouldn't want our kids to hear, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, in my experience, there's been some redactions along those lines, and I'm totally not in favor of that. I think it really it makes them, these leaders, out to be somebody they're not in some cases. And I want to just be clear that with the temple and some other sensitive things, that's all good. That's all fine. Those things are sacred and sensitive, and they need to be redacted. But when we're dealing with the humanness of a leader, those things should not be redacted. And sadly, I've seen instances where they have been redacted.
It's interesting when you think about that. What came to my mind was Facebook and Instagram. It's almost like they want a Facebook profile pic. They want their wall to be clean of nothing vulnerable or bad, right? They just want it to be them on vacation all the time with their families, and look at how wonderful my life is without showing. And the thing that I find so damaging about that is that this is what I think is a big struggle, and I've experienced this myself, is that it promotes a view of people that are not accurate, and it makes other people who know their own accuracies feel as though they're never going to be good enough. When you go to, and I'm only thinking about this in the course of rank and file membership in the church. uh you go to church, everybody's wearing their Sunday best, all the kids are eating Cheerios in the pew, and you know what I mean, and the every not every, but most of the guys who are getting up to bear their testimony, I'm so grateful for my wife, I'm so grateful for this, my life is so wonderful, and all of these things. And the problem with that is when you know inside that your life doesn't look like the cookie cutter version of what everyone is trying to portray, that leads a lot of people who are faithful to not want to come. And uh and that's, I think it's the same thing, right? Is that you sit there and you go, there's this person, this iconic figure who's so wonderful. If you're not willing to like look at the humanity and show like, yes, this person did every once in a while cuss, this person happened to turn the TV on Sundays to watch football, like this president of the church who grew up in a time when everybody was racist happen to have some racial prejudice, right? I mean, to show that you're not that far off, that we're all having a real human experience. There's so much utility in that, and I'm curious why why these people that you're talking about don't want that out there. I mean, do you have an idea why they don't?
Oh yeah, yeah. So some of the brethren, and I want to qualify some, not all, because they have different opinions about a lot of things, as you can imagine. But some of the brethren still follow the Elder Packer, Elder Benson, Elder Peterson mode of history. Only write it if it's faith promoting. Only tell it if it's faith promoting. And so if you believe that philosophy, then that filters down to the correlation committee, and they don't want material in there where somebody might see an apostle or a prophet as being a little too human. They just don't want that in there because it's not faith promoting, they would argue. Now, it seems like you and I are on the same page here, where it could be faith promoting because you can see their humanity, you can see their personality, you can relate to them more. But that's not how the correlation committee thinks. And I've told this story many, many times in public. I've shared it with general authorities who come to my talks at the history conferences I go to. And I say that its church is not served well when it's not transparent. Mm-hmm. And more often than not, when I get on my little soapbox in circles like that, they agree with me. But the problem is they don't hold the levers. And right. Well, there's some examples I could give. I probably shouldn't, at least on air. But they have had issues in the past about polygamy. How much should we say about polygamy? And how much should we say about a prophet's mental health issues? That's another one, right? Mm-hmm. I hear this stuff and I'm thinking, Latter-day Saints, or anybody for that matter, who struggles with mental health, whatever it is, they could find something really, really faithful or inspiring learning about the mental health issues of a leader.
Bringing that up, I have heard Jeffrey R. Holland speak about situational depression that he's dealt with. And I remember thinking those were some of his best talks because he felt so human and so reachable, so attainable. And you know what I mean? Just hearing him say, here, I get lonely, I get sad, it's not all me just having spiritual experiences all the time. It really made him reachable, which I appreciated.
Yeah. I think he crossed a threshold when he acknowledged publicly his issues with mental health and depression. But I'm thinking of George Albert Smith, right? I don't think you're going to find in a lesson manual anytime soon that he was really, really depressed. I mean, as the church president, he had nervous breakdowns. His mental health was probably as fragile or more than any other church president we've had.
Wow.
And yeah, Joseph F. Smith had some interesting issues, and there are others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the interest of transparency, that sort of record needs to be transparent when we look at letters of theirs or journals or whatever, writings maybe. But yet, the correlation, that's just something they would not want out, right? That George Albert Smith had a history of mental breakdown. He had several in his life. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I'm not a physician. I don't have his medical record, so I don't really know what led to it. I don't know how it came about, but I do know that he's had several nervous breakdowns throughout the course of his life, both as an apostle and as church president. And so correlation would not, if they were to publish his diaries tomorrow, I can guarantee you they would strike all of that out.
Wow.
And Elder Holland, I'm speculating here, but I think I have good grounds. Elder Holland, since he broke that threshold, that, obviously it's out there. It was his story to tell because it's his life. But I think correlation, they just feel like they have to protect the church. And that's fine. That's what they do. That's their charge, is to protect the church. I guess from my perspective as a historian, how they think protecting the church and how I think protecting the church are really two different things, because I think transparency is the best way to protect the church.
Well, and the thing is you may be protecting the church right now, but the truth is going to come out. I mean, who would have thought in 1980 and 90 that the internet would completely change the way we get information and make it completely, you're unable to hide a lot of this info anymore. And think of the damage that some of those decisions that were made has done. I mean, as I've said multiple times now, most of the people I know who have struggled with church history have not been struggling with the doctrine itself, but the way that it was portrayed so they feel a little betrayed. And I've been able to, I have a lot of friends. I am too. I just go, well, people are imperfect, and I still believe the doctrine to be true. Some of my friends, that's not the way they've handled it, and it's unfortunate because that is such a fixable error. You know what I mean? When it's one thing when you have somebody, the conversations that I have, it's one thing when someone says, "I don't believe the doctrine." Then you go, well, yeah, that's kind of not a fixable, It's just, yeah, that's okay. Well, then, yeah, you probably shouldn't come. You know what I mean? Whereas when you have somebody who says, yeah, I was offended by this or that, or it really bothers me the way the church handled this. It's like, that's such a fixable thing. You know what I mean? And how do you turn, it's like, how do you turn that boat around?
Well, the church is trying, they are trying, because they've seen some of these surveys that we're talking about. Patrick and I, our mutual friend Jana Reese that he mentioned earlier, she's done some great work with disaffection, why people leave. And she's done lots of surveys, and it's not because they got their feelings hurt or the bishop offended them or they wanted to sin and party. Those are not the reasons why people are leaving. They're leaving because of transparency issues that we've talked about with church history. They're leaving because of social issues, right? They're friendly towards LGBTQ, whereas the church they perceive as not. And those are difficult things to reconcile. And the only way the social issues are a different ball of wax, because you're moving into the doctrinal realm, right? When you deal with LGBTQ and how that would, if the church were to come out and accept, this tomorrow, that would obviously conflict mightily with the proclamation of the family. But the historical issues, I agree with you, are easy to fix if you have the right people to fix them. I've been asked before, if it's true, Matt, that Peterson, Packer, and Benson had views of church history, and Kimball and McConkie had different views of church history. Why is it that Packer, Benson, and Peterson, why is it their version has sort of won the day? And the answer is really quite simple. Kimball and McConkie too, they didn't make this a priority in their ministry. I mean, President Kimball, when these discussions really emerged in the 1970s, he was worried about proselytizing the world. He was worried about missionary work. How these, pesky historians doing what they do, that just wasn't high on his list. And he had great affection for Leonard Arrington, the church historian. In fact, Kimball told him one time, he said, Leonard, or Brother Arrington, the Lord is pleased with your work. And that, of course, was very affirming for Leonard Arrington, because he had come under withering assault from Benson, Peterson, and Packer for some of the work that his office was turning out. They thought it was too secular, too materialistic. It wasn't faith promoting. And anyway, so President Kimball, the church president, to say that to this historian was faith affirming. But the problem is that Leonard Arrington got fired, and they basically shut down the church historian's office, having a Ph.D. run it, and they moved him to BYU because President Kimball believed he allowed this to happen, because if he didn't reassign Leonard, the fear was, of course, President Benson would have shut him down and fired him altogether without a job. So he basically got let go. I guess the official word is reassigned, but let's call it for what it is. He got let go, and he got moved to BYU away from the prying eyes of some apostles who didn't like what he was doing. And Elder McConkie was the same way. He had other things that were higher priority to him. And so neither he nor President Kimball felt that they wanted to expend energy fighting against the three apostles who thought that history should be faith promoting. And I think, let me say a word about Elder Holland. We were talking about him a minute ago, that when Bushman wrote his book, Rough Stone Rolling, it was assumed that because it was written by a major university, it wasn't university, it was written by a major commercial press, Alfred Knopf, it was assumed that he would have to tell a story that would be much, much different than most Latter-day Saints were accustomed to, right? Joseph Smith's father drinking alcohol, the prophet and his gold digging, polyandry, all of these things. And this is what the historical record reveals, right? And anyway, so Elder Holland read his book, and he wrote him something really interesting. This is from Leonard Arrington's or Richard Bushman's diary, February 6, 2006. This is what Holland wrote to Richard Bushman. You and I knew, and everybody else knew, that you would have to deal with things as honestly and forthrightly as you could. Nevertheless, your faith and loyalty are apparent on every page. And Bushman was really happy about that statement, because Elder Holland had recognized that he had to tell an honest history, and that he couldn't leave out, Joseph Smith Sr.'s drinking or the polyandry. That would be a dishonest history if he were to do that. And obviously, it could lead people to the wrong conclusions, right? Because one of the things that we know about Joseph Smith Sr. is that he had revelations himself. He was a revelatory guy. He had dreams, right? And you can imagine how some people might view the drinking, right? Oh, sure, of course he has dreams. He's drinking.
Of course, he's having hallucinations, right? Yeah,
exactly. And that's just obviously, as Elder Packer put it, some things that are true aren't very useful. That would be an instance of that,
right?
But as a biographer, if I were critiquing Bushman's book and he didn't put that in there, I would have dinged him for it. I would have said, where is this? This needs to be in there. And I'll tell you why. It's not because you're bringing up dirt on somebody. That's not it at all. It needs to be in there because it's part of the prophet's experience growing up. It's part of living in a home of a father who was drinking heavily. But also it's important, I'm not justifying this, but it's also important that there was a major economic recession during the formative years of Joseph Smith's life. And there were people in upstate New York losing their farms all over the place, including the Smith family. Gee, wonder why Dad was drinking a little bit. He was depressed, right?
Sure.
And there's a way to explain that where I think that people can understand it. They may not agree with it, but that's what he did. He turned to the bottle, right, to make sense of some of this stuff. And also, too, it's important to know that there wasn't a word of wisdom. There wasn't a health code at this time, right?
Sure. And even when it was instituted back then, it was a recommendation, not a commandment.
That's another one that some of the brethren, that we're talking about transparency. I'm reminded of something that Desert Book published in the 1970s that raised a lot of hackles at church headquarters from Elder Packer, Peterson, and Benson. And it was a book of letters. I think it was called Letters to Brigham Young's Sons. And anyway, it was published by Desert Book, and it was just letters they had discovered in the church archives that were in several boxes that nobody knew was there until Leonard Arrington became the church historian and discovered them. But anyway, in this book that Desert Book published, there were two things that these three apostles took umbrage at. And one was that when Brigham Young sailed across the Atlantic and arrived in England, the first thing he did was open up a bottle of wine and drank it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that the three apostles didn't like in the book was that when Young died in 1877, his descendants squabbled over his estate. They were fighting like cats and dogs over who got what.
You mean like every estate ever in the history of the world?
But see, you and I see it that way, Josh. And I think
Right.
I dare say most people would see it that way. And, it's obviously that's not faith promoting, but it's not faith discouraging either. It's just like they're just people who have
Right.
differences over their father's will. And the drinking thing, I think, is that, like you said, the word of wisdom, it was just counsel to follow. If I were giving talking to Latter-day Saints about this, that Brigham Young and his son got drunk or drank. I want to say drunk. That's how I remember it. They did drink a lot. But anyway, they had some wine when they got across the Atlantic. It was a safe passage and it was a long passage. And so they celebrated with wine. I would simply say that the word of wisdom did not become what it is today until around World War I, where it became a litmus test for temple orthodoxy. That you cannot have a temple recommend unless you're abstaining from coffee, tea, alcohol, and tobacco. Brigham Young was not violating any sacrosanct rule at that time. And because the word of wisdom, we tend to think that it's always been this way. But that's one of the utilities of writing church history, is that you help people to understand how the church changes, both culturally, doctrinally, politically.
Well, and that's what's interesting about that in particular, is that if you read the Doctrine and Covenants, it's right in there. Not by way of commandment, by word of wisdom. I mean, so it makes more sense to read it the way of not being a commandment back then. But this is the thing that I find that is somewhat of a struggle for me, is that I can understand, like I do this myself, right? I mean, when there's a question where you can use it. I just had another podcast with a couple of friends. We were talking about, someone wrote in a question about faith, and it was a faith crisis question, just three members of the church talking about their different perspectives. One was an institute teacher, my friend Tim Wild, and the other one was worked for the church. And talking about these things, I was like, every one of these questions, you either choose to have faith or you choose to doubt. I mean, you have to, right? I mean, we're doing that in every single thing. All of these things, it's not about the evidence, it's about how you feel about it. What I think is a struggle for me is when members of the church, and I'm getting this from what you're saying, is when there's like kind of seems to be this unwritten defend at all costs, even the indefensible. So that's the struggle I have, right? Is that when you have these people who are just like, it doesn't matter, you know what I mean? It doesn't matter, what it is. I'm just going to always believe everything was supposed to be the way it was. It's just I think that there's some critical thinking that needs to be done there. And I think that that's what this academic, research and these academic books do.
Yeah, I'm not under any pretense that somehow I'm going to write my book and that my academic book and that people are going to read it in droves, because I think there's there's a truism that we as humans, we don't like to have our sacred cows, challenged, or we like the narrative that we've created for ourselves because we've learned it and heard it for so long. And the challenge for academic historians, Josh, is like myself and Patrick too. He talked about, some of his ward members coming to his university classes and sitting in and having, like, whoa,
Right.
they're just hearing things they've never heard before. And they're hearing it in a language that they've never heard before, an academic language, as opposed to, say, gospel doctrine language. And I think that our task is to get Latter-day Saints who don't typically read scholarship to see why it's important and to see how it can benefit them as a member. I'm proud that my mother one time taught a lesson years back from one of my books. She said, "Oh, I brought in some insights from your book today and gospel doctrine." And of course, they came up to me afterwards. "Oh, that was interesting. Where did you get that from?" And of course, my mother, being the proud mother, "Oh, it's my son."
Yeah.
So that was kind of cute. But I've heard people say that thank you for writing this book. It's increased my testimony. It's that's not what I do. I don't try to increase anyone's testimony or tear it down, but I've had plenty of people read my Benson book, for example. Had a bishop in Kansas, had a general authority write me, had a institute person write me recently. And the 3 emails are all the same, which was, thank you for giving me insights I didn't know existed. It only increased my faith in leaders in the church. I know they're human. I know they make mistakes. And I appreciate that you could write about these things in a very sensitive way. And I thought, man, that makes me happy. And I think that they were writing. I don't know these people. Those are 3 different people that reached out to me on their own accord just to thank me for my work. And it made me happy because A, they found it useful, and B, they probably don't read scholarship a lot. Mm-hmm. And I did some podcasts. I think they came across my book from the podcast. It's not because they follow, university book catalogs.
Right.
And so anyway, there was some utility there. I guess I'm just old school. I think that truth and transparency always serve people. And I've seen so many counterexamples when the church hasn't been as transparent as it needs to be about a topic. And like you said, Josh, they go on the internet and they find it and they're just all of a sudden disturbed by it. And in my view, it's an unforced error. It doesn't have to be that way.
Sure.
We just talked about 3 examples about mental health, about cussing, about the third one I gave about, those are race. Those are easy to explain to people because it really lets you know that these are people that you can relate to, that they've walked maybe a similar path that you've walked in terms of hardship.
Well, and that's what I think is so important, right? Is the whole purpose of my podcast is to show, I have a variety of different people on and a variety of different topics. I've had members of the church who are transgender, gay, different things like that, and them just sharing their stories. And my whole purpose in that is to have my diverse group of listeners understand that everybody's having a very real human experience. And I appreciated that Jeffrey R. Holland shed a little bit of light on his very human experience. And it's refreshing for someone like me who I've got struggles, some small, some very not small, that that I think we all have our things that make us feel less than. Nobody's perfect. And it's great to hear that even the people that you view, you idolize, you look at as the pinnacle of morality, still struggle. And that's what I've appreciated about your books in reading both the Benson book, but especially the Race of the Priesthood book, just because that one highlighted so many different people within the church, so many different apostles, and showing each one of them had their own human issues that they were dealing with, and all of that came together to lead us to a place where something miraculous like that, something significant like that could happen. And I just appreciate that. And that's what I think, I love having you and Patrick and different people on to share the real story so that we can understand that, yes, these are real people. They're not characters in a book somewhere. That's another thing is I think that sometimes I try to remind everybody when they talk about these things. If you look at the Bible realistically, all of those prophets had problems too. We don't know them super detailed like we do now because they're not as far close in time. But I was like, have you read the Old Testament? I mean, like some of those guys had some real issues, and 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 so it just reminds me of our own humanity, and I think that that's great. I think it's important. Well, Matthew, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to me and my listeners about this. Patrick too, even though he bailed out early, he was scared of this part of it, So no, I'm just joking. But we'll definitely, I'm sure we'll have you back when your book comes out. I'll be one of the first ones to buy it, and we'll have you on and talk about it again. Of course, always appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Josh. I enjoyed talking to you today.
All right, we'll see you.